Right. So I'm going to be talking about principle-based transaction prioritization. What is it? How does it work? And why do we need it? So first, let's do a quick demonstration of why we need this, kind of a motivation for why are we even talking about this. Okay, so not every transaction that goes on a blockchain is created equal. They do a lot of different kinds of things. So some transactions, you're just transferring funds from one wallet to another. For example, you're putting stuff into a cold storage wallet from a hot wallet. Maybe you're doing a deposit into a DeFi protocol. Maybe you are doing a token mint. Maybe you're submitting a Oracle price feed, which has a validity interval. Maybe you're doing a very high stakes liquidation in a collateralized debt position. So there's lots of different kinds of transactions that goes on the chain. Now, in principle, some of these have different levels of time sensitivity. And at the moment, there's no mechanism to sort of deal with this time sensitivity. So specifically what I mean is, if you imagine that you have an axis that describes the value of a transaction, and the function is over delay. So you can think of this as time. So how long from I submit a transaction until it actually gets put on the chain and sort of accepted? What is the value change of that transaction depending on the delay? So for example, if I'm doing just a transfer from my hot wallet to my cold wallet, I'm just putting it there, I'm probably not going to touch it for a couple of years. The initial value of that transaction is whatever value it is, and if this transaction takes 20 seconds to complete, or if it takes 3 minutes, or if it takes half an hour, or even if it takes 5 hours, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't impact the value of this transaction. So the value profile of this, just cold storage transfer is virtually constant. It doesn't really change as a function of delay, right? So if the transaction is delayed, it doesn't really matter. Now, some other transactions have a different kind of response to delay. So if you delay a transaction by a certain amount, maybe it goes down in value. You can imagine certain swaps, like you're trying to catch profits at the top, but your transaction is delayed. So by the time you actually manage to try and pull profits, maybe the price has gone down. So you can see that the value of this transaction starts out pretty high, and then it goes down a little bit over time. Maybe it even sort of approaches zero as you go on, right? Now, some transactions are actually inherently useless after a certain point. So there is a concept called a time validity interval. So this would be, for example, a price feed, right? So if you measure the price of a token at 12 p.m., then it may not be valid until 5 p.m. the day after, right? It may have some sort of interval in which you need to update the price for it to be valid. So for example, if you're measuring the USD price of ADA or some other asset, then this price moves a lot, and depending on the type of system that you're setting up, it might be more or less sensitive to these kinds of moves. So you might have to update this thing pretty frequently. So maybe it's an hour, maybe it's 10 minutes. For a very, very high stakes protocol, you might even have less than that, so 1 minute or something like this. So there is some sort of time interval. So it's valid between 12 p.m. and 12:05, for example, right? So the value of this transaction would be very high initially. So, if this is 12, then this is 12:05. After that, it has zero value. So the value curve, you can imagine, goes quickly down, and then at the 12:05 mark, it's completely useless. It's just garbage that's contributing to congestion at that point. So this would be a Oracle price feed, right? Now a lot of protocols depend on things like this, so they need to be able to reference this price feed in their protocols for it to operate safely. So the price feed itself needs to make its way onto the chain, because that's the only way that these protocols can actually get the the right price for it to reference in a decentralized and secure manner. So these Oracle price feeds, for example, are a pretty high priority transaction that might have to go through. Now, some transactions as well, they are of a very different class in this, because you can see that all of these transactions that we've seen so far, they never go below zero, right? Because the worst that can happen is that it becomes worthless and it's just garbage that goes on the chain. But there is a specific type of DeFi transaction called a liquidation, where the idea is you pay down debt and you reclaim collateral. Now the debt and the collateral may fluctuate independently in price. So if you start a liquidation, you're paying down $1,000 worth of token A to reclaim $1,100 worth of token B. But token B is collapsing in price. Right? It's happening off-chain, it's happening in centralized exchanges, whatever happens to be the circumstance. But you're starting the liquidations, you're paying down $1,000 worth of debt, and you're expecting to be able to claim $1,100 worth of collateral. Now, by the time the liquidation actually completes, the collateral has collapsed so much in value that now the collateral is only worth $900, right? So after a certain point, if you have a liquidation, the initial evaluation is pretty high. There's incentive there. It's defined by the protocol. And then it starts going down and down and down and down. And after a certain point, it becomes negative, right? You're actually losing money from this trade at this point. So here, we're in the negatives. We're seeing red numbers like this. So if a transaction has a delay that's longer than this, it's actually costly. The value is negative. You're losing money from trying to do this. So you're better off not submitting it at all at that point. But if that transaction isn't submitted and it's not accepted in time, then the protocol isn't safe, because liquidations, for example, that I'm using in this case, they are a vital part of DeFi and every sort of collateralized debt position protocol. So if there are no liquidations, then the protocol isn't operating safely, and the end victim of this is going to be the depositors, the people that put their tokens in there and expecting some yield and sort of contributing to the DeFi and the TVL of the ecosystem. They are the sort of inevitable victims of this case. If the liquidations don't go through, they are the ones sort of left holding the bag, right? Okay, so this is part of this is the motivation, right? This is the why we need transaction prioritization. Because in a nutshell, these kinds of transactions, the cold storage transfers, the swaps to an extent, they're not created exactly similar, right? And especially the liquidations and the Oracle price feeds, they have very different sensitivity to delays. So we need to be able to differentiate these transactions, at least to an extent, where we can get the priority transactions on chain in time, and then that will enable the ecosystem to build applications that are time sensitive. And if we don't do this, we don't get protocols that are time sensitive, that are also secure, and the ecosystem suffers for it. So we'll get less applications, less dApps, less things built on this, less everything basically. So that's the why. That is why we need transaction prioritization. Now, what is transaction prioritization? So typically what you'll see is transaction prioritization, like you see in Ethereum with EIP 1559. It's a kind of fee market, right? You pay gas fees or you pay something to get a prioritization. So you pay the transaction fees anyway, as you sort of have to do, but then you're paying some extra to get prioritization in the queue. So you have like a big bag of transactions that are just waiting on the sideline, and then the ones that are paying sort of more gets to skip the queue, right? Gets to go in front of the line. So that is an example of a fee market. which is one way of solving it. Personally, I don't really endorse this kind of thing. I think tying finance directly to transaction prioritization is not necessarily the best way of building a robust and flexible and sort of useful ecosystem. You'll end up basically just catering to whales and sort of bot traders that have big bags, right? Those are the only ones that are able to sort of afford these things, and you can see during times of high traffic on Ethereum, you're seeing $40, $100, $200 gas fees for just basic transactions, which just isn't usable by regular people. So fee markets, in my view, is not the way to go. Oh shit. Having some technical difficulties. There we go. Yeah, so fee market, in my view, not the way to go. Now, there was a proposal, IOG wrote an article, and they wrote a research article as well, pretty recently, about a modification to the EIP 1559 approach that they called tiered fees. And I know that DC Spark wrote something along these lines as well. So what this means is that you dedicate a certain portion of the block space to different kinds of transactions. And in essence, what you're doing is you're trading a delay for a cheaper gas fee. So you're accepting a longer time to get included on the chain in exchange for getting a cheaper transaction. But the tiered fees means that you have kind of a fixed type system of cost, which allows the high prioritization or the high sensitivity protocols to use the higher tiers and regular users to use just the normal tiers. And it's still kind of preserving this this idea of the deterministic fee structure, which I think is kind of central to Cardano. It's one of the major selling points in my view, that a transaction costs the same no matter what the time of day is, right? That's kind of a unique value proposition that I think is very useful to try and safeguard and keep. Now, one of the problems with tiered fees, if we're going to be implementing this in practice, it's going to take a while. It's going to be reliant on input endorsers. Input endorsers are 24 months away, so we're looking at least 2 years, right, before we have something along the lines of tiered fees, which is, in my opinion, way too long. Not because I just want this new feature right away, but because we're going in, before then, we're probably going into a bull market. We're probably going to be seeing a lot of traffic, a lot of congestion, and now we have a lot of DeFi applications that have launched, which are very sensitive to these kinds of delays. So tiered fees is, okay in my view, but it's too far out. Like, even if you're making something simple, it's not really deployable in what I think of as sort of an appropriate amount of time. There are other issues with tiered fees as well. So, for example, the lower tiers might still be clogged up with high tier paying transactions. So basically what you do is either you pay the higher fee on chain, or you pay an equivalent amount of high fees off chain, and you get the transaction prioritization anyway. So basically, in this case, you'll have the higher paying people getting prioritization whichever way you cut it. So even the lower tiers, which is supposed to be filled with regular transactions for people that don't want to pay this extra, it's still going to be prioritized by this off-chain sort of shuffling and under the table kind of dealings, right? So I could pay an SPO to always prioritize my transactions, even if they're in the lower fees, or even if they're in the lower tiers. Right? So I don't think the tiered fees is ideal in any case, and especially with the delays, I don't think it's a realistic option. Now, what I'm going to be proposing is a different approach to this altogether that doesn't include changing the fee structure at all. We're going to be keeping the fee structure exactly as is. Deterministic fees still pretty low, still, adjustable based on the token price and all of these good things that we sort of have in place already. Instead, it's going to be based on merit or on principles. Let's first go to an analogy. Imagine this scenario, right? This is a typical analogy that you'll see for congestion on chain is traffic, like literal traffic with cars in the highway, which is a good sort of analogy, right? Because up here you have where the block creation is happening, the transactions, i.e. the cars, are trying to get in there to be part of the block, to be sort of put on the chain. Now, during congestion, there's more cars than there is capacity to create blocks, or more transactions than there are, there's space in the blocks. So they're standing in the line and trying to get in. Now, at the moment, there's no way of differentiating one car from another. All of these are basically treated the same, except for maybe the size of the transaction determines whether or not it can fit in the remaining space. But other than that, there's no sort of telling if there's a woman in the back of one of these cars giving birth, if there's a guy here that has a kidney that someone's waiting for a transplant and it's about to expire. There's no way of knowing what's sort of going on inside of these and sort of helping them get to where they need to go. Now, in a situation like this, the way that I think of fee markets is basically, you can add a rich guy in a helicopter up here, right? That's basically a fee market. Like, there's some guy here that's paid a bunch of money to get a super prioritization, and he can just skip the line and go here. This is kind of what a fee market is, which is like anyone can get in this chopper. Like the only thing that sets him apart from the others is that he could afford the helicopter. Now, I want to move a little bit away from this way of thinking about how to prioritize transactions into a more, what I would consider a more sort of Cardano way of dealing with this, I suppose. And the analogy is, imagine that one of these cars is put in here, and it turns out it's an ambulance. So imagine that this car is an ambulance. It has a siren on top, it has some clear markings, that this is a vehicle that has something that's going on. It has the siren and the blue lights and everything. So when there's traffic, you really see this guy coming, right? You have, you look in your rear view mirror, there is, oh shit, I need to move to the side to let this guy pass because he presumably, right, he has a dying patient in the back, or there's a fire to put out somewhere, or there's a shooting going on and we need to stop them, right? There's different classes of vehicles that are given the right to drive with a siren and with these blue lights and with these clear markings, and we think of them as usually they're emergency vehicles, but basically what this is a social contract, right? We all agree that these kinds of services are worth giving prioritization even if there's traffic. We're moving out of the way to let these guys pass because the service they provide is worth prioritization even in these conditions. So even if you end up one car behind of where you're going, like you're in traffic anyway, what does it matter, right? So that's the underlying principle of these emergency response vehicles. Now, if we take this analogy apart and we sort of try and figure out, okay, is there any way we can put this into our current situation? Of course there is, right? So how do we translate this analogy into something that is workable in our situation, right? And we're back to blockchain, we're working with transactions, stake pool operators, and the Cardano ecosystem as a whole. What I'm proposing is, if we set up a list of principles, right? And these principles define what we as a community consider worthy of prioritization. So what do we think is important enough for a transaction to be sort of put in front of the queue? Like, what is required for a transaction to drive around with the siren? Right, so these price feeds, for example, might be a very good candidate for this. Layer 2 settlements might be a very good candidate for this. Maybe people don't agree that liquidations should be getting this sort of prioritization, especially since it's a multi-step process. Okay, that's fine. That's up to the community to decide what goes on to this list of principles. We have a shopping list, right, with all of these principles that define what is required for a transaction to be given priority in the ecosystem. Now, once we have that list, where do we go from there? So we have the community. These are everyday people like you and me, ADA holders in general. They're able to vote to change this, very, very much in line with SIP 1694. Being able to do these kind of governance actions, right? So you're able to vote on what goes onto the list of principles. Now we need some sort of entity here. Maybe this is akin to the Constitutional Committee. Maybe this is akin to the stake pool operators. Maybe this is akin to some completely different group, right? I'm not trying to sort of shoehorn anyone or any group into this position, but we need some sort of mechanism to evaluate whether or not a script adheres to these principles. So for example, you have a project A. Pick your favorite project, right? I don't want to single anyone out. Project A says, okay, I have these two types of transactions that I think is worthy of prioritization. So you have TXA. This might be a batching script, for example, which is pretty common. And then you have TXB, which is a separate function. So maybe that's a liquidation, which could be separate from the batching, right? So these are two different scripts, and they want both of them to be added to the given priority. So then you have this body, whatever it is. Let's just say that it's a set of SPOs, for example. But it could be something else. Now these guys take it could be the D-reps, it could be lots of different people. They take these scripts and the application submitted by Project A, right? Project A submits this application. They take the scripts, they look at the set of principles, and they say, okay, transaction A adheres to all of the principles. Congratulations. This script is deemed worthy by the list of principles that we all agreed on, that we all have power to change, that yes, transaction A is given priority. Now what happens? We create a list similar to the token registry. So this would be like a script registry. So we create a registry very similar to the token registry that we have today, a GitHub repository or something like this that is public. Everyone can sort of view exactly what is on there. And you take the approved application that transaction A is approved, you put it on here. So now transaction A, whenever there is a transaction submitted onto the blockchain that uses script A, right? So this is the script that this project applied to be given prioritization. Whenever a user is interacting with the script and submitting a transaction onto the chain, the stake pool operators or the stake pools that receive this incoming transaction, they look at the script registry and they see, oh, script A, I recognize the hash of this script. It needs to be given priority. So they put it at the top of the mempool instead of the bottom. So next time there's a block being minted, this is first in line to get in there. Now, maybe script B was not approved. So then that doesn't get the approval. Now notice that in this scenario, it's not a direct vote on individual scripts for all the people, right? You set up the list of principles. Projects can apply to what they think is a priority-worthy script that follows all the principles according to their views. And then it's evaluated. The application is evaluated. If it's approved, it gets put on the registry, and then stake pool operators are referring to this registry whenever they're minting new blocks. So if the community in this case decides that, hey, having oracles and time-sensitive applications is cool and all, but you know what I really, really want to be giving priority? This guy's NFT mint, right? So, okay, if you get enough people to vote for that, to add, append to the set of principles, your favorite NFT mint, if you manage to convince enough people to vote for that, okay, that's the community's vote. Like, if the community, whatever the community decides as a valid principle, sure, that's what goes, right? So there's no censorship in terms of what the community is able to do here, but that's the freedom under responsibility, right? You're responsible for your own actions. If this is the kind of thing you vote in, then you live with the consequences of that choice, right? So this is true decentralization. This is sort of the spirit of SIP 1694. So this is what I propose as a new mechanism for dealing with transaction prioritization without fee markets, right? So I will probably write this up into a Cardano improvement proposal and submit it, but I just wanted to get the conversation going, put it out there, see what people sort of think of it, get some feedback. The feedback that I've gotten so far has been primarily positive, but I wanted to sort of, bring this debate up and get people to think a little bit outside the box. We don't have to tie prioritization directly to finance. This is just one example of another way we can do it. There's probably better ways of doing it for all I know. I just want to help people sort of breach this barrier of, okay, we only see it in terms of finance, right? So that's my 2 cents. Talk to you guys later.